Hmm. Let's go ahead and wait a few more minutes for others to show up. And let's give it maybe one more minute before we go ahead and start. Okay, why don't we go ahead and start? So welcome to the Chow Center for Asian Studies Transnational Speaker Series. And I am Stephen Lewis, faculty member here in Asian Studies, and also a research fellow at the Baker Institute for Public Policy's China Studies program, one of the co-organizers of today's talk. And I'm very happy to have you all come. Thank you for coming. And you've already seen directions in the chat about how to ask questions. So we're going to go for about 30 minutes with the talk and follow that by question and answer. Plenty of time for question and answer. And the question and answers, go ahead and type those into the question and answers. If for some reason you want to be anonymous, you can go ahead and send me in the chat, I believe, a direct message, and then I can read out the question. Either way, I'll read out the questions that come, and Dr. Katz, our speaker, will be happy to answer them. Our speaker today is Daniel Katz. He's a non-resident scholar for the Baker Institute China Studies program. He's also currently serving as a coordinator of programs and curriculum at the New Diplomacy Institute down the road at the University of Houston in Clear Lake. His research is on defense diplomacy, and the subject of his book, Defense Diplomacy, Strategic Engagement, and Interstate Conflict by Routledge. Dr. Katz has a lot of previous affiliations that make him just the right person to talk about this topic today. He's worked at the State Department, the Center for New American Security, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Asia. He's written extensively on global security issues and U.S. China relations. His PhD is in strategic studies from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Tech in Singapore. He also has a double Master of Science degree in International Affairs from the joint program between Peking University and the London School of Economics. And he has a BA in International Studies and Classics from Yale University. And it's actually, my association with Dr. Katz goes back to when he was an undergrad at Yale University, and he did some internship work for us. And we stayed in touch, and his work is endlessly fascinating, and he's a wonderful resource. And so we asked him to be a non-resident scholar. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce him. The title of his talk will be "The Emerging International Security Order in Asia, Is a New Cold War Inevitable?" So Dr. Katz, please take it away.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank Professor Lewis for the kind introduction, and I'd also like to extend my appreciation to the Chao Center for Asian Studies and the Baker Institute for hosting this talk. My remarks today reflect my private views only and do not represent those of the Diplomacy Institute or the Baker Institute. When this presentation was originally conceived several months ago, the Indo-Pacific region was far less tumultuous than it is at the present time. Multiple worrisome security developments have emerged in the past year, from fatal clashes along the China-India border to increased military threats from North Korea, to rising concerns over conflicts vis-a-vis Taiwan and the South China Sea. Fault lines are appearing throughout the Indo-Pacific region. The prevailing consensus among strategists is that a new Cold War is emerging, albeit of a different character than the original US-Soviet Cold War. The Cold War, which developed in the aftermath of World War II, was primarily a military contest underpinned by an ideological struggle between Soviet-style communism and Western democracy. In addition, the US and the Soviet Union had little economic interchange. By contrast, the relationship between China and other major Indo-Pacific powers, including the US, is far more complex, characterized by economic interdependence, technological competition, and military rivalry. If a new Cold War may be on the horizon, what can be done to avert such an outcome or prevent a catastrophic conflict in the world's most dynamic region? Given recent events, heightened tensions, and evolutions in Asian security architecture, discussions regarding strategic engagement as a tool of conflict mitigation are especially relevant today. A definition of the concept of strategic engagement is in order. Strategic engagement encompasses a subclass of defense diplomacy, specifically between actors who are potential adversaries. Strategic engagement is defense diplomacy, which leads to the establishment of instruments that allow otherwise adversarial states to manage their relationship with the ultimate goal of diminishing the risk of interstate conflict. In fact, strategic engagement is often reserved for countries whose relationships may be poor and in need of improvement. This would certainly apply to the current state of affairs between China and the US, China and India, as well as South Korea and the US vis-a-vis a nuclear North Korea. As Dr. Carl Sagan once said, you have to know the past to understand the present. In that spirit, let us begin with some historical context of the Indo-Pacific region. The post-World War II regional security order was marked by a strong set of bilateral relationships between the U.S. and its treaty allies, including Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea, sometimes referred to as the hub and spoke system. In addition to treaty allies, the U.S. has maintained partner relationships with multiple additional Asian countries. This system of alliances and partnerships contrasts with Europe. There is no Asian analog to NATO. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, was established in 1967 by Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, with an implicit anti-communist underpinning. Between 1967 and 1999, an additional 5 countries became ASEAN members: Brunei, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia. The founding principles of ASEAN enshrined in its declaration do not involve defense and security matters. Rather, they are concerned with issues such as economics, education, and socio-cultural cooperation. An early outgrowth of ASEAN was the formation in 1994 of the ASEAN Regional Forum, known as the ARF, to address regional peace and security issues. ARF participants include the 10 ASEAN member states, as well as Australia, Bangladesh, Canada, China, East Timor, the European Union, India, Japan, Mongolia, New Zealand, North Korea, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, Russia, South Korea, Sri Lanka, and the US. ARF meetings are attended by foreign ministers and operate under the philosophy of, quote, decision-making by consensus, non-interference, incremental progress, and moving at a pace comfortable to all. In the wake of the ARF's formation, the East Asia Summit, or EAS, was created in 2005 with 16 members, consisting of the 10 ASEAN members and Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. From the outset of the EAS, which was another ASEAN-led initiative, there was considerable debate over the composition of the body, which is an annual head of state level gathering. Ultimately, the US and Russia were permitted to join the EAS in 2011. The EAS describes itself as a, quote, forum for dialogue and cooperation on broad strategic, political, and economic issues of common interest and concern, with the aim of promoting peace, stability, and economic prosperity in East Asia, with 6 priority areas of cooperation, namely environment and energy, education, finance, global health issues and pandemic diseases, natural disaster management, and ASEAN connectivity. Finally, 2006 witnessed the establishment of the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, or ADMM, composed of defense ministers from the 10 ASEAN member states. In 2010, an expanded forum known as the ADMM Plus convened, consisting of ASEAN states as well as 8 dialogue partners: Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, Russia, South Korea, and the United States. Stated areas of focus are maritime security, counterterrorism, humanitarian assistance and disaster management, peacekeeping operations, military medicine, humanitarian mine action, and cybersecurity. All of the aforementioned efforts have been orchestrated by ASEAN and driven by the principles of the ASEAN Way, which is characterized by non-interference and mutual respect. However, the increasing economic and military rise of China has spurred a more robust impetus for a strategic partnership among like-minded countries. In 2007, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, was initiated with Australia, India, Japan, and the U.S. Though short-lived initially, following the withdrawal of Australia in 2008 under Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, the Quad was revived in 2017 and gained increased prominence in 2020. At that time, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo put forward the notion of transitioning the Quad into a formal security alliance. Most recently, in September 2021, the inaugural Quad Leaders Summit took place in Washington, D.C. under President Joe Biden, hosting Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India, Prime Minister Scott Morrison of Australia, and now former Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga of Japan. Supplementing the Quad is the Australia-UK-US Security Accord, dubbed AUKUS, newly announced in September 2021. AUKUS entails the provision by the UK and US of the materials and technology for the construction of 8 or more nuclear-powered submarines to be built in Australia. Although AUKUS is not explicitly focused upon countering China's military power, particularly in the South China Sea, this is implicitly the goal of the initiative. China reacted strongly against the announcement and threatened Australia with retaliation. In order to understand the role of strategic engagement in conflict mitigation and improved transnational cooperation, we will now explore 3 case studies. The first case study will be an analysis of China and India. The 2 countries share a 2,500-mile-long contested border, which was the principal cause of a brief war in 1962. This border war featured 2 fronts, Aksai Chin in the west and the Arunachal Pradesh region in the east. Both sides suffered casualties, but historical consensus suggests a Chinese victory. Although low-level border skirmishes continued in the ensuing years, a confrontation resulting in loss of life of dozens of individuals occurred in the Galwan River Valley in June 2020. As of October 2021, Chinese and Indian military commanders have met 13 times in an effort to defuse tensions. The latest round of talks broke down on October 11th over areas along the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh. Tens of thousands of troops on both sides are planning to dig in for a second consecutive winter amidst the harsh Himalayan conditions. India alleges, quote, unilateral attempts of the Chinese side to alter the status quo, while China maintains that, quote, the Indian side continued to insist on unreasonable and unrealistic demands, which made the negotiations more difficult. In the maritime domain, there have been no major reported clashes between China and India. However, the potential of an incident at sea is rising due to China's greater maritime presence well beyond the first island chain into the Indian Ocean, and India's increasing maritime deployments in areas such as the South China Sea as part of its Act East policy. In summary, although there is a current impasse in military-to-military discussions between China and India, there has been progress in resolving several disputed border areas since talks were initiated. This proves the positive potential of strategic engagement, which will become all the more relevant in the future. Next, we will look at strategic engagement on the Korean Peninsula, specifically that between North Korea vis-a-vis South Korea and the US. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953 ended in an armistice which persists to the present day. Almost 30,000 US military personnel remain stationed in South Korea, ostensibly to guard against security threats posed by North Korea. Military-to-military dialogues between North and South Korea were dormant between 2007 and 2018. In June 2018, 2 star generals from both countries met in the demilitarized zone for the first time in over a decade, days after former US President Trump announced plans to suspend US-South Korea military exercises. In addition, North and South Korea maintain government and military hotlines, which have been periodically suspended by North Korea. In October 2021, North Korea restored use of the hotlines as a good faith gesture. However, in September 2021, North Korea conducted multiple missile tests, including cruise missiles, train-launched ballistic missiles, and a purported new hypersonic missile. The guiding objective of all negotiations with North Korea has been denuclearization. The 2018 North Korea-US Singapore Summit, 2019 North Korea-US Hanoi Summit, and 2019 Korea's US DMZ Summit did not produce any significant breakthroughs. The general consensus among the US strategic community is that the probability of North Korean denuclearization is remote. South Korean President Moon Jae-in has floated the notion of a formal declaration of an end of the Korean War as an impetus to entice North Korean denuclearization. Although such a formal declaration by the US would have few practical implications, there is the risk that such a move would imperil the justification for the continued presence of US military forces in South Korea. US President Joe Biden has offered to meet with North Korean counterparts, quote, anytime, anywhere, without preconditions. Although strategic engagement can be a valuable tool of statecraft, one must be realistic about the seemingly insoluble dilemma of a nuclear North Korea unlikely to denuclearize without significant US concessions, to include sanctions relief, suspension of military exercises with South Korea, and a withdrawal of US forces from the peninsula. Due to continued US security commitments to its ally South Korea and ongoing military provocations by the North in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, such concessions are unlikely in the near to medium term. Third, and most significantly, let us turn to US China strategic engagement. Since the US opening to China under President Richard Nixon in 1972, China has undergone transformational growth in the economic and military spheres. China is now the world's second largest economy and has the largest military in terms of number of fielded forces. The Sino-US bilateral relationship is widely regarded as the most consequential bilateral relationship in contemporary international relations. Since Xi Jinping assumed power in 2012, China has grown more nationalistic on the world stage, rejecting Deng Xiaoping's maxim to maintain a low profile and bide its time in favor of a forceful power projection posture. Sino-US relations have particularly deteriorated in the past 5 years, during which Washington alleged that Beijing was, quote, ripping off the US and was responsible for an increasing trade deficit as well as the loss of American jobs. The US and China have been engaged in a reciprocal trade war that has not solved any of the underlying issues. Furthermore, the COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in early 2020, which originated in Wuhan, China, and spread worldwide, has further exacerbated an already fraught US-China bilateral relationship. Historically, Beijing has expressed its dissatisfaction with US policies, notably the sale of military equipment to Taiwan, by suspending military-to-military engagement. The military diplomatic relationship between the two countries has experienced ebbs and flows since its inception, but has markedly deteriorated of late. As can be seen in the chart, in the period spanning 2012 to 2019, US-China military exchanges peaked in 2013 and have progressively declined since. The Strategic and Economic Dialogue, or SNED, which commenced in 2009 under former President Barack Obama, served as an important forum for Sino-US strategic engagement. This was replaced in 2017 by the U.S. China Comprehensive Dialogue, one of whose pillars was the diplomatic and security dialogue. This new Track 1 dialogue mechanism was subsequently abandoned in 2019. Since October 2020, there have been no reported meetings between U.S. and Chinese defense officials regarding crisis management. However, a virtual meeting known as the Defense Policy Coordination Talks at the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense level occurred in late September 2021, with the public readout referring only to competition and not mentioning cooperation or crisis communications. Multiple recent attempts by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to meet with Chinese Vice Chairman of the Central Military Commission, Xu Qiliang, were rebuffed. History has demonstrated that direct communication between the U.S. and Chinese militaries has in fact averted dangerous incidents at sea. Since the defeat of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang in the Chinese Civil War in 1949, China has never accepted any possibility of an independent Taiwan. Eventual reunification of Taiwan with the mainland remains the preeminent core interest of the PRC. While the US does not officially acknowledge Taiwan as an independent country, Washington has sold arms to the island pursuant to the Taiwan Relations Act, while simultaneously denying such sales to the mainland since the late 1980s. Under the terms of the 1979 TRA, the US commits, quote, to consider any effort to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means, including by boycotts or embargoes, a threat to the peace and security of the Western Pacific area and of grave concern to the United States, and to maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security of the people on Taiwan. Tensions flared between 1995 and 1996, with PLA ballistic missile firings prompting the deployment of 2 US aircraft carriers off the coast of Taiwan. China was adamant that it would never countenance such a humiliation in the future. Within the past year, the US has continued and arguably accelerated its defense relationship with Taiwan. In August 2020, the US approved an additional $750 million in arms sales to Taiwan. In addition, personnel from the US Army and Marine Corps have been advising and training Taiwanese military counterparts as part of a rotational deployment. Contacts between higher-level US and Taiwanese officials have also taken place. Current Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, who was elected in 2016 and re-elected in 2020, has explicitly rejected the mainland Chinese offer of one country, two systems, promulgated by Chinese President Xi Jinping in January 2019. During the first week of October 2021, the PLA flew a record 149 sorties into the southwestern portion of Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ for short. While some of the increase in sorties may be attributed to Chinese National Day on October 1st, it also coincided with a large multinational maritime exercise in the Philippine Sea involving ships from the US, UK, Japan, New Zealand, Netherlands, and Canada. There has been a concomitant rise in bellicose rhetoric in recent commentary from prominent Chinese strategists vis-a-vis Taiwan. Speculation abounds about whether and when China might mount a blockade or invasion of Taiwan to achieve its goal of reunification. The Taiwanese defense minister has stated that such an attack could occur by 2025, while US Indo-Pacific Command projects a timeline closer to 2027. Strategic engagement between the US and China will not alter the PRC's ultimate goal regarding Taiwan. However, diplomacy between the two establishments could advance the interests of peace if the U.S. conveys a strong message of deterrence to China. The U.S. has maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity vis-a-vis Taiwan for 4 decades, under which the U.S. does not specify whether its military would help Taiwan defend itself against the Chinese attack. It may well be time to abandon this posture, given China's increasingly aggressive actions and statements. For approximately 3 decades, China has been engaged in disputes over features in the South China Sea with other claimant states. Beginning in 2013, China commenced land reclamation activities and militarized several islands. The U.S. has pursued an active policy of freedom of navigation operations known as FONOPs as a challenge to any country's infringement upon the right to fly, sail, and operate whenever international law permits. The U.S. does not acknowledge China's expansive 9-dash line, which encompasses almost the entirety of the South China Sea. In November 2014, the U.S. and Chinese militaries signed a memorandum of understanding related to the safety of air and maritime encounters. This MOU represented a reaffirmation of the 1998 Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, known as the MMCA. In September 2015, the U.S. and China agreed to an annex to the MOU entitled Rules of Behavior for Safety of Air-to-Air Encounters. Alongside these bilateral agreements, a multinational agreement known as the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, or CUES, was adopted at the 2014 Western Pacific Naval Symposium. In 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled as part of an arbitration initiated by the Philippines that Chinese maritime claims based upon alleged historic rights had no legal basis. Until the U.S. and China are able to arrive at a compromise regarding FONOPs, this issue will continue to impair the quality of bilateral strategic engagement. In February 2021, China implemented a law which authorized its Coast Guard to employ force against foreign vessels perceived to encroach upon its sovereignty. In September of this year, China introduced a maritime traffic safety law, which mandates that all ships sailing within China's territorial waters must notify Chinese authorities. Both regulations are in violation of United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provisions regarding innocent passage. The importance of direct military-to-military engagement has been recently demonstrated in the U.S.-China context. On October 30th, 2020 and January 8th, 2021, U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, spoke with his Chinese counterpart, Chief of the Joint Staff of the Central Military Commission, General Li Zuocheng, to reassure him that the U.S. was not planning to attack China. General Milley reportedly had intelligence indicating that China was concerned that the U.S. was indeed planning to launch such an attack. The second call occurred 2 days following the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, a period of considerable domestic political turmoil in the U.S. The value of a personal relationship between 2 high-level military leaders from adversarial countries cannot be discounted. Given heightened tensions in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, crisis communications as an outgrowth of reliable mill-to-mill channels are of vital importance to avert an escalating conflict between opposing forces in the event of accident or miscalculation. In light of the 3 case studies we have discussed, it is worthwhile to examine whether and to what extent strategic engagement can contribute to cooperation on transnational issues, such as climate change, pandemic response, and nuclear nonproliferation. As regards climate change, multiple defense ministers have declared climate change to be a national security issue. However, major countries around the world, including China and India, have prioritized economic growth over climate mitigation. Recent global energy shortages and increased demand for energy inputs have only exacerbated the problem, as demonstrated by rising coal usage. Short-term expediency is taking precedence over long-term environmental impacts. China in particular has pursued linkage of climate change initiatives to its strategic priorities and core interests, including Taiwan and the South China Sea. As was pointed out in a recent Baker Institute study by Gabe Collins and Andrew Erickson, a viable approach to incentivize Chinese climate cooperation would be the imposition of carbon taxation, border adjustment taxes, and the assembly of a climate coalition premised on competition. Bilateral strategic engagement between adversarial countries is unlikely to yield meaningful dividends on climate change. Traditionally, cooperation in the area of military medicine is a form of non-traditional security activity, even between rival nations. Although military medicine collaborations, such as the use of hospital ships amid pandemics or other public health crises, may be considered low-hanging fruit, there is value for national security establishments to provide assistance to other countries whose medical resources may be limited. Militaries could also consider working cooperatively on vaccine distribution and inoculation campaigns. China, India, and the U.S. all possess nuclear weapons. The prospect of nuclear war, whether intentional or accidental, threatens all of humanity. It is incumbent upon governments and their militaries to improve crisis management mechanisms to prevent a non-nuclear confrontation from escalating to a nuclear exchange. Nuclear arms control talks and overall non-proliferation efforts are not progressing among major powers. Of particular concern are strategic weapons modernization initiatives by China in the form of reported tests of nuclear-capable hypersonic glide vehicles, which would imperil the efficacy of any current missile defense technologies. In addition, China is allegedly considering a shift from its long-standing nuclear doctrine of no first use to launch on warning, further increasing the threat of accident or miscalculation. China is not active in nuclear arms control negotiations with the U.S., citing a gross disparity in the number of warheads between the two countries. Even semi-official Sino-U.S. nuclear dialogues have been of limited efficacy, with discussions typically devolving into debates over semantics and condemnation of U.S. deployment of ballistic missile defense systems in the Indo-Pacific. Deficiency in strategic engagement between the U.S. and China on nuclear weapons issues heightens the risk of conflict. Because of the strong role of nationalism in disputes between China and India, on the Korean Peninsula, and between the U.S. and China, there is greater potential for progress on transnational issues if multilateral ASEAN-centered bodies such as ADMM Plus and the East Asia Summit are empowered. This would widen the aperture of diplomatic discussions in a more cooperative setting. Multilateral fora can oftentimes have greater potential to make progress on key issues than politically charged bilateral negotiations. In summary, is a new Cold War in Asia inevitable? While it is certainly possible given the disturbing trends that are emerging in the contemporary regional security order, this outcome is by no means assured. It is unrealistic to believe that China will alter its stated core interests, including reunification with Taiwan and control over the South China Sea. Bolstering multilateral institutions with robust strategic engagement efforts is an important path forward for reducing the risk of conflict. In addition, continuing to strengthen multinational coalitions, such as the Quad and AUKUS, can serve as a powerful deterrent to Chinese irredentism. In the meantime, there must be an intensive focus on diplomacy between security establishments of Indo-Pacific countries to avoid the prospect of war. To close, I would like to quote the late U.S. diplomat, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, who said, "A peace deal requires agreements, and you don't make agreements with your friends, you make agreements with your enemies." Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Katz. Very, very informative. Let's go ahead and turn it over to questions. So if you have a question, type it into the Q&A section, and I'll read them out just so for the video record, we've actually got them as well, and people can see them. And if I believe our attendees can post questions. If not, I have a bunch. Well, let me go ahead and ask one. Since I know that a lot of your work has been historical work, and in particular, you've looked at, what were the efforts before World War II for UK and Germany to talk, and then, of course, during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And you mentioned these three kind of spheres of like environmental, which wasn't something that concerned, before the very recent era, and pandemics. Well, there were pandemics before, but there was no question about working together on them. And then the most recent one, nuclear, there has been discussion. What I'm wondering is, what about the role of other kind of like public goods spaces? Either like, the polar regions, for example, is something scholars have talked about, or outer space, and I know recently there's been a lot of discussion about talking about space debris. And especially with having more commercial actors on the American side taking over from what NASA historically done. But China has now been has plans to go to the moon, I believe, and then also they've certainly gone around it, I believe, and they also have a space station, but they are also working hard to create a new international space station to replace the one that is scheduled to be retired. And in recent administrations, I know the American government has been, through Congress, has been insisting that we can't let China participate in the International Space Station. What about the possibility for space here, given that, as I recall, during the 1970s, the Apollo-Soyuz mission started off a long series of collaborations, not with the Soviet military and the American military, but between these ostensibly, space agencies to keep them demilitarized, but also creating a track record of working together that has turned out to be very useful, especially since we retired our space shuttle program. So very long answer, but what about other public spaces? And the role in bringing in maybe other transnational actors, but working with China in particular on these. What do you think about the potential there?
I think it's a great idea, and something that not only the U.S. but other actors in the Indo-Pacific are looking for areas of cooperation with China, and to try to de-link some of these more contentious issues over sovereignty and I guess territorial disputes that I mentioned in the presentation, try to figure out how we can broaden the scope of the agenda. Ideally, we should be able to de-link the issues, the persistent underlying issues on which there may not be much headway in the near term, and try to see where we can collaborate, whether it's on climate change, but as you allude to in the space arena and these other critical areas, in the Arctic and elsewhere. I think there's potential for these kinds of issues not only to appear through the ASEAN-based platforms, but perhaps for new institutions to emerge, issue-specific type institutions for these vital issues. And as you said, I mean, the military is potentially one actor, but not exclusively the actor. So you could bring in scientists, scientific communities. In the case of the space arena, you could bring in other non-governmental experts. And what's been successful in the past sometimes with these issues, has been to launch a track 2 unofficial platform, or perhaps a track 1.5 involving a mix of non-governmental experts and also governmental experts acting in their private capacity, and see where there might be potential to eventually upgrade to an intergovernmental track 1 platform. This was tried in the cyber arena between the U.S. and China, for instance. There were some fairly productive track 1.5 discussions for a period of time, but then those negotiations unfortunately hit an impasse and floundered. But I think it's still worth the effort to try to bring together these expert communities, non-governmental and governmental and military, to discuss these vital issues that are going to impact really every country in the region. So absolutely, I would say, expand the agenda, consider these public goods type concerns that that impact us all.
Okay, thank you for that answer. We now have 3 or 4 questions. I'll start with one of the ones in the chat section, or excuse me, in the Q&A section. Thank you for your comments. How do you think the progression of Xi Jinping's highly consequential military reforms going on since 2015 will affect U.S. China military to military engagement?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think the military reforms are absolutely having an impact on the state of U.S. China mil-to-mil engagement. If for those who haven't been following the military reforms closely, the emphasis has really been primarily on China modernizing its force to pursue joint warfare in a fashion that the U.S. military has been engaged upon for the last several decades. So it's, although there are large numbers of fielded forces in China, the goal of the Chinese military now is to focus on these very specific missions in pursuit of its core interests. And that may mean fewer forces in any particular context, but more sophisticated, better trained forces that are focused on joint warfare with an informatized component. So certainly greater emphasis on cyber warfare, and just generally better integrating the various arms of the PLA. This has actually been one of the challenges the last several decades between the U.S. and Chinese military establishments, because there wasn't always a direct corollary for the U.S. military counterpart. For example, the Chinese Minister of Defense does not possess typical operational authority, operational control in the sense that the U.S. Secretary of Defense does. And so this is part of the motivation for the current U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, trying to speak to the Vice Chairman on the Central Military Commission, because he believes that's a more appropriate counterpart to discuss these matters with. And China disagrees on that on protocol grounds. So as these initiatives to better modernize the Chinese military are rolled out, I think the U.S. and China need to proactively pursue a strategy of figuring out who the appropriate counterpart would be for example, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, or China's integration of its maritime militia into some of the operations in the South China Sea, figuring out who the U.S. On the U.S. side would be able to speak to for those types of contingencies. And so I think that's something that requires some active effort. It's certainly the modernization efforts by the Chinese military are well underway, but I think the diplomatic mechanisms have somewhat lagged that modernization effort. So I think it has impaired to date some of our diplomacy, and something that needs to be worked upon.
Great. Thank you for that. The next question is a little bit longer, but it seems the U.S. is alone, as most multilateral engagements in the region solely involve the U.S. interacting with EAP countries such as Australia, New Zealand, etc. Outside of AUKUS, which is a rarity of its kind, what do you see as the barriers to increasing engagement between the non-EAP middle powers like France, other European countries, and the US in the EAP? France especially seems to be pursuing its own strategy in the EAP almost independently of other non-EAP powers, likely because of its territories in the region. Is this for fear of provoking China potentially, or possibly to maintain the leadership mantle among Euro powers in the EAP?
Also a really important question. I would say that's really an accurate assessment that, unfortunately, some of the European countries have not been integrated into some of these multilateral outreach efforts. And I think that's something that's a mistake and something that ought to be rectified going forward. So I'd say, France is certainly an important Indo-Pacific actor. There are other, important actors in the European Union, and I think the U.S. and its other partners in the region would really benefit from their thinking. I think the more there's an exchange of ideas, I think the more likely we are to achieve the peace and stability in the region that everyone is looking for. And so, I think possibly just bolstering the channels, the transatlantic channels that have existed, since the conclusion of World War II would really, be of benefit to expand those discussions to actively include discussions on the future of the Indo-Pacific order.
Thank you. And one other question, what are the grounds for China's interest over territorial disputes with Taiwan and India? How do they interact with the US interest over East Asia? What would be the situation when peaceful negotiation is no longer an option?
So I think, there depends somewhat on the context. I would say in the territorial dispute with India has a very strategic role in China's geoeconomic and geopolitical value for China. There are critical road arteries that run through those disputed regions that are vital for Chinese economic objectives. And so I think that's partly what's driven it, in addition to just general emphasis on sovereignty concerns. And I think, as I mentioned, the dispute with Taiwan is longstanding and really relates to issues of history and is among the preeminent core interest as far as China is concerned. These really are central to how the U.S. is approaching China generally in the Indo-Pacific, because while there is no formal treaty with Taiwan and obligation, there are these sort of unofficial obligations that the U.S. has taken upon itself vis-a-vis Taiwan. And as concerns India, India is increasingly a strategic partner of the U.S. and in the military security domain. And India has long prided itself as an independent actor and non-aligned, and I think that will continue. But India is very concerned, particularly in the wake of that incident last year, loss of life of their soldiers, and they're seeing that peaceful negotiation, may not, be the only avenue for resolution of that dispute. There's certainly, they've done 13 rounds of these negotiations so far. I think, India would like to continue to pursue that, but in the meantime, both countries, are preparing for military contingency should that be necessary. And so a conflict, whether on the China-India border or over Taiwan, needless to say, would be catastrophic for the region and the world. It would lead to large economic disruptions, and concerns about the Taiwan issue are loom large for all U.S. Allies and partners in the region, because they look to the U.S. and its support for Taiwan in the event of such a contingency as really central to the obligations that the U.S. has taken upon itself for its allies and partners elsewhere in the region.
Great, thank you for that. There's also in the private chat, somebody has sent me an anonymous question, more about kind of the domestic determinants of China's foreign policy and motivations. So to what extent do you think China's decisions regarding foreign policy are driven by rational considerations versus domestic trends towards nationalism? In other words, how much do you think rational incentives through multilateral arrangements between China's neighbors will actually affect Xi's Chinese leadership's decision-making?
I think, great question. It's, I think absolutely the domestic factors within China must be taken into account when looking at its external behavior. And we would all like to know the internal thinking of the Central Military Commission and the Politburo, but in the absence of that, we have to look at China's behavior in the international arena. And there are domestic considerations, very significant ones, such as seemingly a slowing Chinese economy. There are concerns that perhaps these other factors, energy shortages and accompanying blackouts, concerns over fresh water, really important concerns that could affect many Chinese people are motivating some of China's more bellicose behavior of late. And so I think the U.S. and other Indo-Pacific actors have to consider very closely how these domestic factors might be playing into the behavior that we're seeing. But nonetheless, I think the multilateral bodies can shape China's behavior and in a positive way, and take into account those domestic challenges and try to see if there are ways to cooperate with China to mitigate some of those concerns, whether they're environmental concerns or energy or the financial system. So I wouldn't necessarily say that that this has to be a motivation or a driver for conflict. If external actors are able to be thoughtful about the domestic concerns within China, it might actually be a way to promote cooperation and positive outcomes.
Okay, and thank you for that. And I actually have a follow-up question. You had mentioned that our defense secretary has been wanting to meet the vice head of their military commission, who obviously is higher ranking within the decision-making body of in China on either the military side or I think on the party side, than the Minister of Defense. And as you alluded to before, that works on their, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well. The Minister of Foreign Affairs isn't even usually, a Politburo member. And so it's typically foreign affairs are, as you well know, run by a vice premier or a state counselor who's also a Politburo member. And right now we have the issue that Yang Jiechi, who's beyond the usual retirement age, he certainly would be very unlikely that he would go into the next Politburo beginning next year in November. And so there's this perennial problem of how do Yang Jiechi knows the United States quite well. In the 1970s, he began to know many President Bush back in the day, Secretary Baker, a lot of people. He's very well known, fluent in English, and was ambassador to the United States. And when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs, he had very good ties with the United States. It raises a question of on their foreign affairs side, who will replace them, and how can the U.S. play any role in trying to nudge China towards getting somebody who knows the United States well and can pay attention? And similarly, on the military side, is there some way that the United States can try and nudge China going into their leadership transition to pick people who are more receptive, understand the United States well, and that we trust more? Or should we also, as you also alluded to, think about rejiggering these various strategic, economic, diplomatic, initiatives that have been bounced around for the last couple of administrations. The final thing other people have suggested in the past is, do we bring a vice president in? And the vice presidents have gone in and participated in those strategic dialogues in the past. So how do we get around this whole problem of China saying, our ministers are the equal of your secretaries when they clearly aren't? Long question again, sorry.
No, all great points. I mean, I think I guess to address your first question, I think even if the U.S. wanted to influence internal processes of personnel within high levels of the party, I think it just wouldn't work. I think it would actually probably backfire, because China would perceive it as interference in its internal affairs, which is something the U.S. is often accused of doing in many instances. Anyways, I think we can certainly hope that the Yang's replacement would be someone who would be knowledgeable of the U.S. But of late, it seems like quite a few of the appointments at high levels in the foreign affairs and defense communities have been very wary of the U.S. and of U.S. action. So the relationship has sort of been on this downward spiral for some time, and I think everyone is sort of waiting to see if we've reached the bottom, and if China wants to adopt a new approach. There is some reason to expect that that China wants stability in 2022 because important events happening within China, the Winter Olympics, important party meetings, and that China would not want to undertake anything destabilizing in the forthcoming year. So that's somewhat encouraging. I think there is reason to believe that might be the case, but these other timelines that people have put forward for Taiwan, for instance, 2025 or 2027, after China passes this next year, still on the horizon. As far as trying to shape the institutions, I think on the U.S. side, the U.S. has tried to do some of this at its National Security Council, putting Kurt Campbell, a longtime China hand and Asia hand, into a role as coordinator of Indo-Pacific affairs, which is not really a designation that's existed before. And he has a number of directors and senior directors under him. And so I think it's an attempt by the U.S. side to try to right size and use the proper channels for approaching the region, and really trying to have a greater understanding of where China lies within the greater regional order. It's not clear to me that that has been done entirely on the Chinese side. I think there's been some resistance to that, as we've seen in at least in its military establishment. I haven't seen any signs of that either in terms of its management of foreign affairs. We have seen some high-level bilateral meetings between the U.S. and China, very contentious meeting in Alaska, and then more recently, the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met in Zurich with Yang Jiechi, and by all accounts, perhaps the temperature was lowered somewhat. That it seems, based on reporting, that there were some more cordial exchanges and more perhaps more progress on discussing some of these vital issues that are on the agenda. And both of those individuals have direct access to the leaders, the U.S. and China. So I think that's encouraging, but certainly more work to be done, particularly on the military to military side. These Navy to Navy frameworks that exist in the form of the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement. I think there's still work to be done in terms of factoring in the maritime militia on the Chinese side and other actors that China either doesn't want to acknowledge or doesn't want to have these operational type actors at the table, more comfortable bringing in counterparts who are very skilled in foreign affairs management and not necessarily operational like the U.S. Navy counterparts. And so, certainly something that needs to be addressed going forward, particularly as the operational tempo of the U.S. Navy and many other navies in these waters is going to only increase in the years to come. And as your last question about sort of bringing in the vice president or senior level attention is extremely important. As particularly in the Chinese system, to have leader level attention or those with direct access to leadership, extremely important for the decision making process, and something that's really been a barrier, particularly in the military context, because these hotlines between the two countries have existed, but the U.S. has often complained no one either picks up the phone, or if someone did pick up the phone, they wouldn't have the authority to make a decision in real time. And so if you were able to figure out a mechanism by which, whether it's leader to leader or deputy leadership, and in the event of a crisis, something could be actioned to dial down tensions, I think that would be extremely useful.
Well, Dr. Katz, thank you very much for your very informative and stimulating talk, and for answering all of those questions so expertly as well. We're now at time, so I'd like to go ahead and conclude the session by thanking you again for sharing your expertise with us, and also to the audience. Thank you very much for turning out for this. In closing, I just want to point out, I think Amber, Simchak, our media expert, will post all of our social media accounts for the Chow Center, so you can get links to us. But on November 17th, we'll have our next talk by Dr. Kakin Chuk, called "Remaking the Transnational Connections: Sikh Diaspora in Hong Kong and the Return Visits to India." So please join us for those, and thank you all for turning out for this wonderful event.